Next, I'd like to go over some functions that we've already used and introduce just a little bit more notation. So Python has a handful of very common functions already built in. Examples of these functions that we've seen are print, input, and length that we've used to find like the length of a string or the length of a list. Those are functions that are so common that Python already builds them in to its vocabulary. It doesn't go so far as to calling them reserved words. They're not quite that, but they're functions that Python already loads in automatically. Another thing that we've had practice with are methods. And methods are actually functions, but they are functions that belong to specific classes or objects. So for example, when we load in the turtle module and we use things like forward, right, home, and position, all of those are functions. They have the same syntax of calling a function where we use the function's name and have the parentheses with possible arguments in between. Those are functions, but they belong to the turtle module. If we were trying to call forward just within a Python program without loading in that turtle module, forward would not be a function that Python understood. And so the forward function belongs to the turtle module, and in that way we call it a method to distinguish that you really need a turtle object in order to call the function. Classes are something that we will study again in the future, so this concept of what it means to have a specific class or object that owns a function is something we'll cover in the future. But for now, we can think of these methods as being examples of functions. We also have two different types of functions. One that we would call a void function. This is a function that's going to perform an action for us and go and do something for us. We expect to send off the function to go do a task for us, and then just have the flow of control return where we left it. A different thing we might want our function to do is to go and fetch a value for us and bring it back after it's completed a task. And that type of function is called a value returning function. So the function goes and performs a task much like a void function would, but when the function returns the flow of control to where we called it, it brings a value back for us. We'll go through examples of these in just a moment, but in the body of a function, when we are defining a value returning function, there will be a special reserve word in Python that we'll need, and that word is called return. Of the functions and methods that we've already seen in Python, I wanted to give some characteristic examples. Remember that the parameters of a function are optional, and sometimes we have functions that don't take in any arguments. Other times we have functions that do need parameters in order for the function to make sense. So all in all, we have 4 different types of functions that we might experience in Python. We might have a void function that goes and performs a task for us and doesn't bring anything back to us at all. Or we might have a value returning function that goes and performs a task but brings something back for us that is useful. We might have a function that doesn't need any arguments or parameters at all, and we might have functions that do need arguments and parameters. And I'd like to point out different examples that we've already experienced of these 4 types of functions. First, let's look at an example of a void function that doesn't need any arguments. In some sense, the simplest type of thing. Remember that the turtle module had a method called home, and what that method did is it automatically returned the turtle to its original position, the origin, and its original orientation, pointing to the east. That method we can think of as a function. It didn't return anything to us. It just did something. It returned the turtle home. And it didn't require any arguments. The home method didn't need any information or anything from us in order to return the turtle home. So this example of a function is a void function that doesn't need any arguments or parameters. Let's both compare and contrast this with Turtle's position function, which we abbreviate with POS. This is an example of a function that is a value returning function, but does not need any arguments. The position function doesn't take in any parameters, but it gives us something back. What is returned by the position function is the current location of the turtle. So you could imagine that if you were drawing something and telling the turtle to go here, there, and wherever, you might lose track of where the turtle is, and you may need to know the position of the turtle before moving on to the next part of your code. If you've lost track of where the turtle is and you need that information, you could call Turtle's position method. You don't need to give it anything, but you do want it to give you something back. You want it to return to you the current position of the turtle. Switching gears a little bit, we could think of the print function as a very good example of a void function, but the print function generally takes in arguments. If we're going to print something, we need to know what it is we are printing. But the print function is a void function because it doesn't give anything back to us. It just performs a task for us, and that's it. But it does take arguments. It needs something from us. What it needs to know in order to work is what it ought to be printing. Last but not least, the length function in Python is a good example of a function that both takes in arguments and returns values to us. If we're going to take the length of something, the length of what is our argument? And there is a value that is returned to us. What is returned to us is built right into the name. We're going to give you something like a string or a list. That's what we want to know how long it is. And what you'll return to me is precisely how long it is. So these 4 different examples help us see similarities and differences between void functions and value returning functions, and those that take in arguments and those that don't.